Thank you so much for having me. I'm Lena Andrews, and I am absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you to the Friends of the World War II Memorial. It's a privilege to be sharing the stage with and the conversation with a group that shares my own passion for this period and for especially for learning its lessons. That was a major reason why I wrote the book that I'll be talking about today, Valiant Women, the extraordinary American servicewomen who served in World War II. And I'm just delighted to be here with all of you and to take your questions and have a conversation with you about this critical period and some of the lesser known women and heroes of this incredibly important war. I am also especially indebted to this organization because without it, I would not have a title for my book. For those of you who are close observers, you'll know that Valiant Women comes from a quote, which is actually inscribed at the beginning of the book, that was said by Harry Truman at the end of the war and is also inscribed on the World War II Memorial in the National Mall. And it says, to paraphrase, that we will never forget the sacrifices of our heroic men and valiant women who served our country in this war. And while, I think we've done a really good job, and rightly so, of heralding and honoring our heroic men, the title was chosen specifically because I think we still have a lot of work to do in honoring the valiant women who served in this war. So thank you for having me here today and for being the inspiration for the book's title. I really am very, very, very grateful for that. So to give you a bit of background, just to start, about the book and myself, I thought I would give you a peek behind the curtain of how this sort of began, how this project began. Because I think many of you may find yourselves in a very similar position, which is to say, before I wrote this book, before I even began this project, I counted myself among the experts on World War II. I'd written a whole dissertation on it. I'd written, I'd sort of looked at every book under the sun about World War II, or at least I thought. And it wasn't until I sort of serendipitously stumbled on the Military Women's Memorial, which is just down at the other end of the mall, right at the entrance to the Arlington National Cemetery, that I really even began to understand the magnitude of the story of women in World War II. Now, of course, I knew about Rosie the Riveter, as many of you, I'm sure, do, and the women who worked in factories, the women who worked, as code breakers or behind enemy lines. As a former member of the intelligence community, I was always a big fan of those really incredible stories of women who served in intelligence operations, of which there are many books recounting their experiences. But it wasn't until I stumbled into the Military Women's Memorial about 2/3 of the way through completing my dissertation on World War II that I was first confronted with this fact, which is that 350,000 American women served in uniform as volunteers in every service, in every combat theater, and in most of the occupations available at the time. And like any researcher worth her salt, I was at first embarrassed that I didn't know more about these incredible women. And I was incredibly motivated to find out more about them, which is the genesis of how this book began. And what happened is I just ordered every single book that I could find, a memoir or, a veteran who had written about other veterans. And it became very clear very quickly this was a really incredible story about World War II that was teaching me something new about military operations in World War II. That I had never really understood before. And so it felt too good to not bring to a wider audience. And that's how I ended up writing the book. And that's why I'm here with you today. So given all that, what is this book about, really? Is it just a collection of interesting stories, or is it a military history, or is it a women's history? It's kind of all of those things. But the place that I most like to start, particularly in forums like this, is to talk about a woman named Mary Sears. If I could see all of you, I would ask you to raise your hand and tell me if you knew about this woman named Mary Sears. Unlike, most of the American heroes of World War II who are men, Mary Sears is not known to most people. She wasn't known to me. But the thing that you should know about her is that she was first and foremost a hero of World War II. And secondly, that she really liked frogs. And the reason that you should know that she liked frogs is because she was obsessed, in fact, with amphibians from a very young age. She grew up in Wayland, Massachusetts, And she would go down to the local pond basically every day, splash around in it, trying to find frogs and other amphibians because she was obsessed with water and underwater life. And what was happening in this little pond just absolutely fascinated her. So this love of frogs, this love of amphibians grows into a passion, which grows into a career. She gets 3 degrees from Radcliffe, which of course at the time was where women who were going to Harvard were placed. And she ultimately gets a PhD in zoology, which at the time was a really small field. After graduating, she goes to what's called the Woods Hole Oceanographic Organization Institute, which is in Falmouth, Massachusetts. And this is all about 1938, 1939. She starts to make a name for herself at Woods Hole because she's, of course, very good at understanding ocean tides and currents. And Woods Hole is their main expertise is building the field of oceanography. And so they're sort of mapping the oceans of the world and the large bodies of water of the world so that we can have a better, more comprehensive understanding of that space. And she's right at the center of it with her 3 degrees from Harvard and her lifelong knowledge of, amphibians and the world under the sea, so to speak. Now, in the 1940s, I bet you all can guess who else is very interested in the oceans. That is the U.S. Navy, of course, is trying to figure out what's going on in the Pacific in particular, in large part because they know that they're about to fight a major naval war in and around many of the oceans, which they don't have a ton of visibility into at the time. So the naval officers, naval leadership at the time, walks over to the Woods Hole organization and guts them. Basically takes everybody who was working there, puts them in a Navy uniform, and puts them to work at what's called the Hydrographic Office. Now, the Hydrographic Office is responsible for creating the maps and charts that were used by sailors and aviators when they were flying and navigating on the open ocean. And just to give you a sense of how important this office was, in 1942 alone, so before the Pacific Campaign really even kicks off in a meaningful way, the office had produced 13 million navigational charts. So that's just in 1 year, and they are incredibly important for lots of reasons. And that's where Mary Sears finds herself when she's plucked from Woods Hole. In 6 months, she is promoted to what's called the head of what's called the Oceanographic Unit. And they are basically responsible for helping the Navy figure out where it should land its ships in the Pacific. And as I said, the Navy at this time has pretty limited visibility into what the sort of ocean floor, tides, beach surface looks like in many of the islands that they're now trying to reclaim from the Japanese, who by 1944 have fanned out in every direction in the Pacific. So this is especially important, of course, not just because the Navy's interested in retaking these islands that the Japanese have overrun, but because they're also debuting one of their most important new doctrines, which is, of course, amphibious assault, the ship-to-shore movement of forces, generally Marines, but sometimes others, on a massive scale in the Pacific. So this is the island hopping campaign, which many of you may be familiar with. But of course, this ship-to-shore movement of forces relies fundamentally on being able to know that the tide is working in your favor and you're not going to get blown off, a couple miles, because in many cases we're talking about very small strips of beach. You need to know what the ocean floor looks like so your landing craft aren't going to get mucked up on a bump or a divot. And you're going to need to know what awaits you on the beach, what sort of terrain is coming your way. And these are not just small questions. We're talking about landing dozens, if not hundreds, of ships and personnel on these little miles-long strips of island beach throughout the Pacific in 1944. And so what does the Navy do? They turn to women like Mary Sears and they ask them, what's going on? And of course, we have very bad information at the time, and it falls to Mary Sears and her office to figure out what's going on these beaches with the bad information we have. And so it should be no surprise to all of you that she succeeds. We, of course, win the war in the Pacific. It is a hard-fought and bloody and difficult war, of course, part of the war that we fight. But Mary Sears was, in fact, integral to advising admirals about when and how they could land their ships in places like Luzon, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. These are all landings where Mary Sears and her office in the Oceanographic Unit are helping U.S. forces get to where they need to go in a way that is consistent and safe for the doctrine of the time. So it would be one thing if Mary Sears was a unicorn, and to a certain extent she is. Not many women at this time had a PhD from Harvard or her level of expertise in the ocean's tides, but here's the thing, she wasn't a unicorn, except insofar as she was extremely talented and smart and probably, beyond the intelligence level of most of us. But when it comes to her being a woman and her being a hero of World War II, she wasn't particularly exceptional. There were literally not just hundreds of thousands of women who served broadly, but hundreds of women just like Mary Sears who were serving, for instance, in the, the Bureau of Naval Personnel or, the Bureau of Aeronautics. These places were filled with women in uniform, women in this case of the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, the WAVES, who were at the backbone of naval operations, of military operations, and of the larger American enterprise to win the war. So I love starting with Mary Sears' story because in some ways she is an exception. She is truly one of the most brilliant women probably to walk the earth at the time, but she is also sort of unexceptional in the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of other women just like her who donned a uniform in World War II and served their country. And so that's where Valiant Women begins, from that premise that there were these hundreds of thousands of women who were making not just a performative social contribution to the war by being women and be serving in it, but making a real military contribution to the war, which is a key point of the book and a key point of what I'd like to share with you for the remainder of the talk today. So again, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't know much about Mary Sears or the 350,000 women like her who volunteered to put on a military uniform during World War II. And I think it's really important to remember that these were all volunteers. No one was pulling them into service. This was what these women wanted to do and felt passionate about doing and about serving. But even more impactful than their numbers is, and of course this is a big number, I don't want to minimize 350,000, but we should be cognizant of the fact that 16 million personnel served in uniform in World War II. So this is a pretty small sliver. Now, 350,000 is still objectively a large number, right? It's about the size of the active duty Navy today. But it's not just the number that we should sort of care about. There is, of course, some real, quantity has a quality all its own, of course, is a very common military saying, but that's not all we care about when it comes to women. In addition to their numbers, the actual content of their contribution is what I'd like to really dig into for the remainder of the talk here, because I think what people don't realize is that when we look at women, we actually are looking at the heartbeat of American strategy in World War II, which is support operations. Because it was support operations, supply, logistics, transport, that sort of stuff that really underwrote Allied victory, allowed us to outman, out-equip, really take the full force of the American enterprise and put it on the backs of the Axis powers. So that's what a big part of the book is trying to get across, that in looking at women, we're also looking at support operations, which is a traditionally unheralded part, but critical part of any military enterprise. So first, I'll just say what I mean when I talk about support operations. I'm trying to be very clear about this in the book as well. I'm talking about the forces and organizations that generate, support, sustain, and allocate material and men, or I should say people, in military operations. So these are things like training units, maintenance units, supply units, construction units, all of the folks who are in the sort of mile to 10 miles to 100 miles to 1,000 miles behind the front. And if we look at those operations, we quickly find that that's exactly where we find many of the women that we are talking about. So these are the people who are fixing planes and tanks and redeploying them in the Pacific. They are drawing maps that helps frontline forces navigate their way through France. And they are, in some cases, training men to use their guns and fly their planes. Those are all support operations that are critical to the front line, and they're all tasks that women were doing in World War II. These are the people who ensure that men on the front line have the equipment and the training and the tools to do their jobs exactly at the time and place that they needed it, which for any of you who have ever tracked, for instance, an Amazon package online, you'll understand the difficulties of supply and support and logistical supply lines over long distances. It's an incredibly demanding part of any enterprise, and it's an incredibly important one in a wartime setting where, the costs of this are incredibly high. It's not just that your Amazon package doesn't get delivered. It's that, men and people are on the front lines counting on that delivery arriving at the right time. So this is all essential work, and it functions as the backbone of battlefield operations. This is something that I've seen in my work on World War II and military operations more broadly. I studied tactical air power for a very long time. And in fact, aviation is one of my favorite examples of this because what it shows is that, of course, for instance, strategic bombing is one of the sort of biggest and most important air power strategies of World War II. Well, there's a big debate on whether or not it worked, which is a book for another time. But it is in many ways a critical part of the Allied strategy for winning the war. And what we find is that not only when we look closer at this particular operation, but not only do we find that the support operations to strategic air power were incredibly important, but that women were in those support operations all along the way. So, for instance, there were women like Susan Ahn, who was training men on how to fly planes, and in fact was so good at doing that they transitioned her to training men how to use their guns, right? So she was pretty incredible, and also happened to be one of the first Korean American women to serve in uniform in the country. In addition, women like Anne Baumgartner, who was part of the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, was ferrying those planes around the country so that they were at the right bases at the right time to then be deployed. And after they were deployed to the theater, they were coming back and getting fixed by women like Jessie Contrabecki, who I had the privilege of interviewing during my research. And, she's fixing altimeters and gauges on these planes and making sure that they can be maintained and sent back to the battlefield. So at every step of the aviation journey, you have women in the support infrastructure who are enabling those frontline operations in a critical part of Allied doctrine to do their jobs and to do them well. So I really love this story because it does, again, unite women and support operations in a way that really beautifully tells the larger story of both of those things. So Valiant Women's attempt to kind of correct the record, and I'll give you a brief overview of sort of how I go about that, because I think in doing so I can share a couple more anecdotes which hopefully will resonate with you as observers of this important time who may or may not know some of these stories. So the first part of the book really focuses on why women were needed and the enormous manpower and materiel challenges that the U.S. was facing. So I, in fact, start with one of my favorite military commanders, General George Marshall, who's an incredible logistician and strategist, and who looks at the math of the manpower equation during this period and realizes he has a big problem. He's going to have to sustain an enormous manufacturing enterprise and a multi-front war literally all over the world with the same group of, 18 to 45-year-old men. And he just doesn't have enough to do both. And so that's when he and others turn to women. And I talk about how all of the services in sequence, so the Army was first, then the Navy, then the Coast Guard, and the Army and Navy Nurse Corps, of course. And then finally, the Marine Corps catches up at the very end, as well as the Coast Guard. But all of them have a women's program that they develop in the face of the manpower challenges that they're facing, basically around 1942 and 1943, when things are really starting to hit the fan in terms of the needs of the time and the needs of the war and the personnel available to fill that need. So in that, we meet women like I just talked about, Anne Baumgartner, who's a feature throughout the book. I really love her story because she is not only a really excellent pilot, but she's so good that she becomes a test pilot at Wright Air Force Base and ultimately tests the B-29 bomber that will drop the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So fascinating story of hers, but that's not the only woman you'll meet at the beginning of the book. The other women, I actually start off with a Navy nurse, Dorothy Still. She has a really heartbreaking story in many ways. Like many women, many nurses, I should say, she was serving in the Philippines at the start of the war. And on the first day, on Pearl Harbor Day, many people forget, of course, that the Japanese also invade the Philippines and begin a slog of a campaign to overtake the islands and force the American Navy, including these Navy nurses, off the island. And women like Dorothy Still were part of the captives who were kept for the entire war in Japanese internment. And she writes a beautiful and heartbreaking memoir of her time in an internment camp. And I should note that many of these nurses, like Dorothy Still, were given the opportunity to escape on some of the last boats and submarines that were leaving the island. And many of them decided to stay because they knew that men would need care in the prison camps that they were on their way to, and they felt that they needed to provide that care. So Dorothy Still was one of them, and you'll get to know her. You'll also meet other women like Agnes Jensen, who is part of a group of flight nurses who end up crash landing in enemy-occupied Albania, rucking their way across the entire country over the second highest peak in the middle of winter, which was thought to be impossible, but they do it anyway, meet up with a British Special Services soldier, then meet up with the American intelligence, and finally make their way out of Albania. It's an incredible story, and just one of many in the beginning where I start to talk about some of these early stories of women serving in various roles, many of them nurses who have incredibly interesting and very harrowing tales to tell. And I should also say in this section, I talk a lot about the women who established the programs because they're critically important features of the story. And in my view, should be sort of as well known as some of the key commanders of this time. So for every George Marshall, there was an Ovida Culpabi, who, is charged with heading the Women's Army Corps, which is the most visible and important role for a woman in the military at any point during this war. And she performs that duty beautifully, and with exceptional poise, grace, and integrity. But very few people know about her. Other women like Mildred McAfee, who led the Navy women's program, the Waves. 100,000 women served under her, and many of us don't know her story. So a big part of the first part of the book is really telling the story, the genesis of these programs and the women who were tasked to lead them, as well as some of the sort of more interesting anecdotes about those incredible women who were on the first front lines of the war. And then I also because it's important to me as a historian and also as a person, I try not to shy away from the mistreatment that many women faced in the early days of the programs, especially. So while I talk about the fact that it wasn't the entirety of women's experiences, I do note that many of them experienced sexual harassment, discrimination, and even in the face of that, did their jobs well. And one of the most moving stories in this respect is the story of Charity Adams and the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, which is the largest group of Black Army women to serve overseas. They go to Europe to sort mail, which sounds like a not important job to most observers these days. But for those of you who know anything about World War II, you know that airmail in particular was a lifeline for many soldiers. And especially this was the case at the end of the war when we're slogging our way through Europe at the final last throes of the European theater of operations. And what was happening was that soldiers' mail was getting caught up in these distribution centers where there were, huge stacks of vermin-infested, moldy packages that weren't getting to men on the front lines. Charity Adams and the 6888 are deployed abroad, and despite the fact that they're facing just really heinous acts of cruelty and racism and sexism all wrapped up into one, become one of the most efficient and effective units to sort through the mail and get those critical letters, packages, word from home to the forces on the front line to remind them that this is what they're fighting for. It's a terrific story. And also, I should mention that this incredible unit finally received the Congressional Gold Medal in recent years after the diligent efforts of many Black women veterans who've been advocating on their behalf for years. They finally were able to do that, and will be the topic of a Tyler Perry Netflix feature film. So I encourage you all to look for that in the coming months. I will certainly be tuning in. Very, very impressive cast on that. So not only will we remember this incredible unit for their integrity and their grace and their poise in the face of not only harrowing conditions abroad, but really difficult discriminatory conditions within the service itself, which of course is segregated, but they're finally getting their due credit today. So we're really, really excited about that. So once I sort of establish all of those things, all of these moving pieces and currents, in part one, what I really like to do and what I do in part two, what I'm happy I did, I should say, in part two, is shifting back to the work that women were doing to really show, like in the case of Charity Adams and the 688, that their stories aren't just interesting because of what they faced as women or as women of color, but also because of what they contributed to the actual war outcome. And that is a very intentional choice. And it's something that I really try and hammer home throughout the remainder of the book. So, I'm trying to make fundamentally an analytic point, which I come to from my years of experience as a military analyst, which is to say that war is a team sport and everybody deserves credit when we win. So women like Evelyn Zahn, for instance, who refused to disclose the details of her work until she died, but I spoke with her family and it became pretty clear that she was the one who was drafting maps for forces making their way through Normandy. Or women like Gertrude Pearson, who were laying cables in the Signal Corps, connecting headquarters to frontline units in Normandy. Or Millie Bailey, who I had the privilege of interviewing 3 times and is she passed away fairly recently, was local to the DC area, so I had the privilege of seeing her in person. But she was part of the Adjutant General Corps, department at the time, not Corps. But when most people don't think of that as being a critically important part or element of the war, but when you think about what the Adjutant General was doing, they were accounting for these 16 million personnel, as I mentioned at the beginning, who were strewn about the entire world and making sure that the right forces were in the right places. And Millie Bailey is a part of that enterprise. And so, as a young Black woman coming from Tulsa, Oklahoma, she decides to sign up and suddenly finds herself doing this critical accounting in the middle of one of the most landmark conflicts of the war. And yet, very few people know about her story. It's through stories like this of Evelyn, of Gertrude, of Millie, that I'm able to share not just really important stories about women, but really important stories about the war and how it was won and the support operations that critically underwrote that. Now, I'll also say that I had the privilege of talking to many of the incredible women who are featured in the book, the living veterans. And since Veterans Day, we're in the season of Veterans Day, I should mention that was one of the great privileges of this experience, was to be able to speak to them about their experiences. Not just because it was helpful to the book, but also because often very funny and very interesting. Millie Bailey, for instance, over Whiskey Sour, told me about the time that she played cards with Joe Louis after an evening show. He had been boxing on the base, and apparently he was a vicious cheater. But at the end, he told her he had been and gave her money back. So her poker game was not very good, but the story was excellent and does make it into the book. But I should say, that all of this analytic and narrative richness is part of a larger enterprise of mine. The why I wrote this book, not just what I wrote, but why I wrote this book, I think is important. And it is very much linked to the women like Millie Bailey and to the season of Veterans Day that we're in right now, which is to say there is sort of a pernicious myth, I think, in the world of national security that while the stories of women veterans may be interesting, they're sort of peripheral to the larger military story that we're trying to tell. And for a long time, I believed that to be true. I thought that I could tell stories about military operations in World War II and in other wars without sort of acknowledging or giving special credit to any veterans in particular. But what I found in this book is that because I looked through the lens of women, not in spite of women or in spite of their gender, but because of their gender, I was directed to a part of the war, the support operations, that were critical and very unheralded in the larger literature on World War II, and allowed me to really make an important military and analytic point. So, For me, it's not just about writing these stories because they're interesting and compelling, which of course they are. It's about writing these stories to lift up their significance in the larger understanding of this important global conflict. And I hope that if you take the time to read the book, and if you've been sitting here with me for the past 20 or 20, 30 minutes, if I'm on time, you have sort of come away with some of that broader understanding. I hope in the question and answer we can talk a little bit more about that. If you have walked away with that larger understanding, then I've succeeded in my talk today. As I said at the beginning, the best way to pay the debt we owe to these women is to know their stories. I hope that learning about some of them today has been interesting and helpful to you. It is certainly part of my larger enterprise and goal, which is to bring these stories to a wider audience. I'm really excited to talk to all of you today about what you think of all this and what questions you may have. So with that, I'm going to quiet down and listen to your thoughts and your questions. And I really look forward to having this conversation. Thank you so much.
Where are you joining us from?
I'm the attic of my home in Washington, D.C.
Oh,
so not far.
okay. So you're local.
Very local, yes.
Well, it was our pleasure to give you the title for your book. We don't expect anything in return. Maybe a copyright every now and again.
Fair enough. I realize now I don't think I actually gave you credit in the book, so I apologize. The second running, I will make sure that it is somewhere in there.
I have to say that about 2 months ago, I wrote an essay for Friends about a woman that you may recognize the name. This is not a trick question. Adela Lutz. Have you come across her name?
Oh, yeah, I've heard it. Yes.
So I I was in the Draguignan American Cemetery in Provence back in September, and a very nice gentleman said to me, "There's only one woman out of, I think it's 878. I forget now. Only one woman buried here, and it was Adela Lutz." And when I found out about her story, I was just absolutely flabbergasted. And I thought to myself, why don't people know stories like this? I mean, she reputedly is the second most decorated woman in US history. Just her story was incredible. So were you surprised when you started to look into women's stories in World War II, just how little people know about all of these incredible women?
Absolutely, yes. I think what was really heartbreaking for me, especially, is because as I said at the beginning, I'd spent so long studying World War II. I mean, this was the entire focus of my doctoral career, and I really prided myself on being an expert. And so when I started to do exactly what you did, I basically found a couple interesting women at the Military Women's Memorial, and then I started to peel it back. And it wasn't like there was just one interesting story. There were dozens. It seemed like, every story was a book in and of itself. And I really did think to myself, if I am coming at this with what feels like so much expertise, and of course you, Alex, are, absolutely, you're even more of an expert than I am. It just felt so heartbreaking that so few people, that I didn't understand it, and also I think put me in a very relatable position to write the book, to say, we're all forgiven to a certain extent for not knowing these stories. But, the way to redeem ourselves is to start hearing them and knowing them and bringing them to a wider audience. And so for me, this is almost like a redemptive act of saying, let me take some of these stories, and they're not even all of the best story, because as you know, Lutz doesn't even make it into the book, amazingly. But it was really a redemption for me. And I hope that readers find it's a bit of a redemption for them, that they can then go and, talk to audiences or to friends and say, oh, have you heard about these incredible women? And start sharing the story more widely, because a lot of this is just totally unknown. And I think, understandably, but heartbreakingly. So yes.
Well, you say understandably, but is this a case of 80 years of sexism? Are we talking about that basically?
In some ways, yes. I give people a little, I'll say this, yes and no. That's like, a classic. Many people know I worked in the IC for a long time. So that's a very classic answer, which is like, it depends, yes and no. But yes, in the sense that there is very much, of course, when we tell and think of stories of military history, we think of men's stories. That is how it's been. And to be totally fair, most of the fighting and dying in American history and American wars has been done by men up until recently. So, that is not something that we should discredit or ignore. At the same time, there's a couple things going on here, some of which are excusable, some of which are less excusable. The less excusable part is, as I think, well, let's start with the excusable part, which is that after World War II, a lot of people, most of this generation, most of the greatest generation, goes home and doesn't want to talk about World War II. It's over. They put it in a closet and they forget about it and they get back to normal. But in 1945 and 1946, normal for most of the women who served was making a pot roast and having kids, and they were forcibly moved out of the positions that they once had. So, there is a cultural and a generational element to this. At the same time, what I found when I was interviewing these women, it's not that they didn't necessarily, they wouldn't talk about these things. It's that they were often never asked. And that, I think, is the inexcusable part of it, which is to say, if you're interested in this sliver of history and you haven't asked about women's stories, then you have to sort of interrogate with your own mind. I had to interrogate this for a long time with myself about why you don't ask that story. Because what I found, especially when I interviewed living veterans, is that the minute that they were asked, I got some really rich, really detailed, and really forthcoming stories. It wasn't like they were hiding it away and saying, this is not important stuff. They knew what they did. I think they were just unlikely to ask to offer the information without being asked. So I think it's worth distinguishing between those two things and asking ourselves why we don't why don't we consider women's stories as a part of the larger narrative.
Can you tell us a little bit about your own upbringing and how you came to be a female spy?
Well, we don't call ourselves spies. So yes, I recently left the intelligence community, very recently, in fact. And if you asked me when I was 5 what I thought I would be doing, I thought I'd be an artist or like a doctor. So this was not the career that I thought I would have. And part of, I think, writing this book is also for women like me, many years ago who were 15, 16-year-olds and didn't see anyone like them in war, giving them a picture of what service can look like in uniform if you are a young woman and you want to serve your country. Because it took me a long time to figure out what service would look like for me. I had uncles who served in the Army and sort of knew their stories. But what really got me tuned into the military was I worked at the United States Institute of Peace down in the National Mall, not far from the World War II Memorial. And I would go to these meetings on conflict resolution and conflict management. I would see all these guys in uniforms, and I realized I had no idea what their uniforms actually meant. And that was a real problem for me because I sort of was I had an analytic mind from a very young age. I didn't want to be in a room where I didn't know who was the most important and who got coffee first and that sort of stuff. And so I started looking up literally military uniforms, and the rest is sort of history. It became very clear to me. It was fascinating. I love studying organizations. So I got really interested in military history, went and did a doctorate on it. And that's how I sort of realized that service was something that I really cared about and wanted to do. At that point in my life, it wasn't going to be military service, but the intelligence community came knocking and was looking for a person who had my profile, and the rest I, of course, can't talk about, or I'll have to kill
you. Please go ahead and try.
I did virtually.
So we have a whole bunch of questions, which is great. The first one is from Joe Craig, and he says, which service was most welcoming to women's contributions?
Yeah, so this is an asterisk question, which is to say, I'll give you like 4 answers. Each of them has an asterisk on it. I could tell you one answer clearly, which is the service that was the least welcoming to women's contributions. And unfortunately, that was the Marine Corps. They get that undistinguished badge. General Holcomb, who many of you may know if you know the history of World War II, was the commandant of the Marine Corps at the time. He's a really tricky character. He's, in many ways, a brilliant commander, but also a very complicated person with some very difficult views to reckon with in the contemporary time. He was adamantly against women in uniform, and he took a lot of cajoling to get women into the Marines. Now, to their credit, the Marines, once women were in uniform, and Holcomb in particular, was very adamant that they were Marines and they would not be treated differently. There are problems with that approach, but he has a great line. All of the women's units have like very kind of cutesy names at the time for marketing purposes. So the Wax and the Waves and the Spars, and it's like they've got all these jingles. And he's got a line. He says, he was asked what they're going to be called, and he said they'll be called Women Marines. They're Marines. Full stop. That's it. There was no cutesy name, and they were in fact called the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. But they had a lot of trouble integrating women early on. And Holcomb, to his credit, eventually intervenes, but he wasn't particularly bullish on women serving. The rest of the services have, like I said, a very complicated sort of footnoted relationship with women. The Army integrates them most fully, so they have the greatest variety of jobs, but they also become the target of a major slander campaign. Marshall, I think, was very visionary with the way that he used women. The Waves take a long time to integrate women. Once they do, they're integrated fully rather than as an auxiliary service. So the answer to your question is they all sort of were welcoming, but all with major caveats on the ways in which women were integrated, which I think is, typical of the time. There was a lot of concern. And so that came through in very different ways, but across every service, certainly.
A while back, I interviewed a remarkable woman, Julia Parsons. You've probably heard of her.
The name sounds familiar, but I don't know the story.
She was a code breaker with the
Yes.
Navy. And I remember distinctly her saying to me, I went through World War II and I broke these incredibly important codes and probably was responsible for a lot of German U-boat crew dying. And when the war ended, I was sad because I didn't want to go back to the kitchen. How many of the women that you interviewed or that you investigated felt that sense of, oh God, I had a chance of a career and I felt fulfilled, and then they suddenly are housewives again? Did you come across that kind of phenomenon?
Yes. Many women, I think because it was such a large group of women, the number of experiences after was incredibly varied. So some just sort of never looked back. Mary Sears is the perfect example. She goes on and becomes like, an enormous figurehead in the larger oceanographic movement, and is known to this day as the mother of that field. But others, and many of the women that I interviewed locally, went back home. And while I never think they would necessarily articulate it, I'm impressed that she was sort of willing to say that she felt a little bit of loss after the war in that way. They found, if they did feel that way, I think often found an outlet for it in their own community. So this is why so many of them, after, serving in World War II, become like pillars of their local communities. Millie Bailey, who I talked about briefly, is a perfect example of this. I went to her funeral 2 years ago. It was a packed house, and it was like cross-sectional. The entire Howard County universe had come out. There were police officers, there were school officials, there were hospital administrators, because she had been involved in everything. And so many of them did find other outlets for that passion. But you're absolutely right. If you had the sort of pluck and the interest to do this in 1943, going back and becoming a housewife was never going to be enough for you. And if anything, where there was disappointment, I think many women were successful in finding other outlets for it. Unfortunately, many of them couldn't continue to serve in a meaningful way because they weren't allowed to. So that is the great shame on us for not allowing them to continue that service.
We have a really good question here. After the war, did any of the women get the same help and benefits as men that served? Now, can you answer that by maybe correcting me or not? Did women benefit from the GI Bill?
Yes. Yeah. So there, again, here's an asterisk, another asterisk answer. So for the most part, yes, there were some complications in the sense that, for instance, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, which is what the WAC was before it became a technical part of the Women's Army, for like a year of their service, they were considered civilians, and it created so many administrative complications that Marshall eventually said, forget it, just make them a part of this service, because I can't deal with whether or not they should get a free Bible. That was like the level of stuff he was dealing with. So that was, for the most part, the experience. And for instance, the Navy right off the bat saw that problem and just integrated them as a reserve force, but still as a official part of the Navy from the start. The exception to this is the Women's Air Force service pilots, which some people may know their story. It's become more popularized rightly in recent years. So these women were contracted directly, essentially, by Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces at the time, and they were ferrying these every combat bomber, every aircraft you could imagine around the country. They were doing this domestic flying to make sure they're at the right places at the right times, and flying these aircraft at this time was a very dangerous job, even if they were not in combat. So I think something like 40 women die doing the job. But because they're civilian contractors, they see none of the traditional Army benefits of service. That includes during the war and then after the war. So it's not until 1977 that the women of the Women's Air Force service pilots are acknowledged as being as having had a military function and get the benefits of their service. And at that point, many of them are in their, into their 50s and 60s. And so that's kind of one of the more heartbreaking stories of this period, is that these women just got really the short end of the stick when it came to benefits, despite having probably the most dangerous job of the group, aside from maybe nurses.
To what extent did women's role in World War II advance all women's cause in the US after World War II? Do you see it as an accelerator? Do you see things fundamentally changing because of what happened in World War II and women's involvement?
Yes. And the reason I say that so emphatically is because it changes it in the minds of the men that matter at the time. And so in the epilogue of the book, Valiant Women, I talk about Eisenhower, who's one of my favorite examples, and of course is, sort of the combat commander of World War II. He starts the war extremely skeptical of women. He thinks all of his needs are, women in uniform in particular, he thinks all of his needs are being met, and he sees no real purpose of having women in uniform in his command. By the time he gets to North Africa, he's not getting the headquarters support that he needs, and so he asks for women of typists, and he, within literally, I think something like 2 weeks, requests a full unit of women to just fully replace his headquarters, because he realizes they're so much better at this particular job. By the end of the war in 1948, he comes out of his retirement to advocate for women being integrated into the military armed forces on a permanent basis, because he was so impressed with the job that women did during World War II. And so, yes, it's an accelerator, because men like Marshall, Eisenhower, Arnold, King, they were all forced to see what women could do. And then when the time came after the war to say, should women be integrated in a more permanent way, they all said, of course. And literally, to a man, every service commander testified in front of Congress to say women should be integrated on a permanent basis. I am really impressed with, and I think this speaks to why they were such visionary leaders, is their ability to say we were wrong, and we're going to get it right on the back end. And because of that, I think we really did see an acceleration of women's integration.
Just a few statements here. John Sanfelice, he says, women who served should receive the same recognition as men. Thank you so much for sharing. Susan Yu says, thank you, Lena. You're a great storyteller, a wonderful skill. And then we have a question here from Julie Ornelas. Is there a good source to find these women's stories to bring them into the classroom, apart from your wonderful, extraordinary book?
Yes, and I will say it's not geared toward a certain age group, although hopefully we'll get a young adults edition out at some point. I would love to do that. There are a couple. So one of my favorite resources for any veterans research is the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, which is basically a searchable database of recorded and written veterans stories. And they're often like 20 or 30-minute clips. And I use that extensively. Gertrude Pearson's story is one of the ones that I found. And it's a very simple searchable function. And often you can hear the women telling their own stories, which is a lot of fun. And then the Betty Carter, I'm going to forget. It's the University of North Carolina, I think, Betty Carter Women's Archives. I can find it and put it in. It's in the back of the book, so you may have to get the book to get it. But I can't remember the formal name. They actually have a collection of letters and memorabilia from women of the time. And it's, again, a searchable database. And so you can go back and search, women World War II by service. And you'll see this like really kind of incredible handwritten notes about time, that they spent in training and things like that. And I got a ton of terrific material. I think for kids especially, it'd be really fun to print out some of those letters and talk about what the women were going through or things like that. Because it's a terrific resource. And it's just a really it's a very transporting experience and very user friendly. So I'd highly recommend both of those. And then of course the Military Women's Memorial, which is not far from the World War II Memorial, so you could do a little loop around them all. I'm sure they also keep a record, a very accessible online record of women who served that people can self input into. So again, those are sort of the three big pillars of primary source material for students and things like that. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
So I'm interested in your reaction to this. I spent a bit of time looking into women who served in the Red Army, our allies in World War II, let's not forget. And there wasn't a single role that women didn't perform just as well as men. So that includes fighter pilots, snipers, you name it, right at the front, winning the war. Have you looked into that area of World War II history? Did you find that inspiring?
It's such a complicated thing right now in this moment, because as people forget, that we had a complicated relationship then with the Soviets, but we especially do today. My favorite book on this is The Unwomanly Face of War, which I have, I think, maybe in the background. And it's written in a very literary fashion. But my favorite story from this, and one that if I could write another book that would sell about Soviet women in World War II, but I don't think in this climate I would, or I could, it would be on this unit called the Night Witches, they were combat fighters. Talk about the best name in sort of military history, the Night Witches, because they would come at night and the men would refer to them as Night Witches because they were these women who would terrorize Allied Axis forces. And they were all, really masterful flyers, masterful fighters. And I think at the exact same moment that we were sort of like reckoning over whether or not women should wear skirts, and it puts in real perspective how different countries and countries in more dire manpower straits were utilizing everything. I think you can see that today, in Ukraine, we see women who I just saw a terrific and heartbreaking story about women who are, deciding to sign up because they know that they're going to be needed because the Ukrainian forces are so strapped. And it's heartbreaking because they're in a position that way, not because they're women, but and they're doing just as well, and they can shoot a gun as well as a guy can. So then and now. Yeah.
In fact, you could argue, using the Night Witches as your example, that they were far more handicapped than their male compatriots. They had the worst planes. They were given the most dangerous missions. So in a way, the women of World War II that we know about that were in combat were better than the men.
Yes, I would make that argument.
You're supposed to nod. You're supposed to nod vigorously.
Yeah. And in fact, I'll share one more story. I know we're almost at the end of time, but this is one of my favorite stories of the U.S. It's in the book, but I'll spoil it for folks, which is people may know the B-26 was called the Widowmaker because it was difficult to land. You had to land it in a different way than most bombers at the time. And men at a certain point refused to fly it because it kept crashing and killing the entire crew. And so the Air Force takes notice of this. And at one of the training bases, they realize that the only way they're going to motivate young male flyers to get back into the cockpits of Widowmaker is to do a demonstration of the Widowmaker up in the air, doing all sorts of spins and flying, landing perfectly on the tarmac, and out walks 2 or 3 I think 4 at this point, WASPs, women Air Force service pilots. And the guys realize if a woman can fly and land this plane, then I can too. And my favorite part of the story is they later asked the women how it was that they landed the plane so successfully. And the guys were like, "How did you figure it out?" And they said, "Well, we just read the manual." Said, read the instructions. So and this is not at all uncommon for women, particularly pilots. They were given some really harrowing tasks, and they performed them beautifully.
Well, as a triplet with 2 sisters, I've always known who the superior sex is.
What a cool fact.
Anyway, we're running out of time, sadly. I just wanted to say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation, an important presentation that lots more people need to know more about. Thank you for correcting history. I wish you all the best. If you need a title for your next book, please contact me or Holly. We'll be very happy to help you out.
I will. You'll be first on my list. Thank you
And
so much for having me.